Shalom, I'm Shani Taragin, and welcome to the podcast Secrets of the Scroll, Hidden Messages of Megillat Esther by Matan Mizrahi, powered by the Walter Foundation. In this series, we're going to explore textual allusions, literary messages that are hidden in the text of Megillat Esther, teaching us messages of not only the story itself, but allusions to the other 23 Sfarim of Tanakh. Please join me on this remarkable journey of learning through Tanakh through the eyes of Megillat Esther. Today we're going to begin with the first allusion of Megillat Esther to basically the first of the Sfarim in Tanakh, namely Sefer Bereishit. And albeit what we're going to find as we open up Megillat Esther is that the Sefer is written in such a way, once again, reminding ourselves that this was listened to. So as we listen to the Megillah, we're going to hear simultaneously messages from all of the Sfarim. What we're going to try to do is isolate the particular messages and analogies that relate to the respective Sfarim. So as we open up a Sefer Bereishit, and we have before us also Megillat Esther, we recognize that it's clear that Mordechai and Esther write the story not just with numerous allusions, as Chazal tell us, Haman min haTorah minayin, and we can go back to Gan Eden, Hamina ha'etz hazeh nochal, but rather to stories that are very overtly alluded to. And by this I mean the tension in the Yaakov and Esav story that we find throughout Persia Toldot, and certainly as many scholars and Chazal themselves allude to in numerous midrashim, the parallels between Esther, Mordechai, and the Yosef story. But let's begin with Yaakov and Esav. How do we know that Mordechai and Esther write the story with these allusions? Well, first, we always begin with the textual associations. And there are certain words that don't generally appear throughout Tanakh, that appear particularly in Megillat Esther in such an overt way that we can't help but hear very loudly the echoes of Sefer Bereishit. Perhaps one of the most famous is when we open up with the beginning of the plot of Haman, and we hear Achar Hadvarim Ha'ela Gidal Hamelach Achashverosh et Haman ben Hamdata Ha'agagi Vayinasehu Vayasem et Kiso Mi'al Kol Hasarim Asher Ito. That verb even of Gidal Hamelach Achashverosh doesn't generally appear in Tanakh, but automatically associates us with the term, obviously, of Gadol. The way that Esav is presented in the stories of Sefer Bereishit and Perach of Zayin, Esav is Beno HaGadol. Already, without even, I would say, probing too much into the text, we already hear of this association by virtue of the fact that Haman is associated with Agag. Agag, as we know from Shmuel Aleph Perek Tetvav, is the king of Amalek, and therefore, Be'ezrat Hashem, when we continue to see associations in Sefer Shmot, we'll see, in fact, to this Agag and the origins, though, of Amalek, that we already hear from Sefer Bereishit as the son, really, of Eliphaz, who is the son of Esav. In other words, when we open up the story of Haman, we have an immediate association with an earlier nemesis of Am Yisrael, namely Esav. So this shouldn't surprise us. What is remarkable, though, is that as we continue within the Perek, the third chapter of Megillat Esther, we hear of Haman, who when he sees Ke'en Mordechai Korea u'mishtachavelo v'yemale Haman chema. Also reminiscent of Esav in the sense that when Haman sees that Mordechai refuses to bow down to him, he is full of anger, very reminiscent of the scene of the blessings wherein when Esav discovers that Yaakov has disguised himself and has basically stolen the blessings, not only is he going to scream out, and we're going to see those psukim soon, but he also tells himself, and when my father dies, that's when I will go and I will kill Yaakov. He says, Yekruvu Yemei Evel Abi v'hargat et Yaakov achi, and that's when Rivka hears this and realizes, Hine Esav achicha mitznachem lecha lehargacha. So we hear about the anger of Esav, and wanting even to kill his own brother Yaakov, and very similarly, Haman, who wants to kill Mordechai. But not only that, here comes the greatest association. The word vayivez be'enav l'shloach yad b'Mordechai levado, ki gidu lo et am Mordechai be'bakesh Haman lashmid et kol hayudim asher v'chol malchut Achashverosh am Mordechai. Haman mocks basically, vayivez, he scorns just killing Mordechai the Jew. Instead, he detests the entire Jewish people. That word vayivez, again, rarely appears in Tanakh, but when does it appear? In the stories of Esav and Yaakov. If you remember, when Yaakov takes advantage, really, of Esav being Ayef v'Yagea, also reminiscent of Amalek, but that we'll take a look at in future Sparim. But what is the response of Esav in those stories? That Esav eats of the Nizir Adashim that Yaakov has prepared, and then we find Rikus Pa'alim, the concentration of many verbs, included in which Vayochal, Vayesh, Vayakon, Vayelech, Esav eats and he drinks and he gets up and he goes, and here's that word, Vayivez Esav et HaBechorah. Esav mocks the Bechorah. So again, Mordechai and Esther are consciously using this term that we really haven't heard since Sefer Bereishit. Vayivez Esav et HaBechorah, and Vayivez Haman l'shloach yad b'Mordechai levado. In a similar vein as Esav looking down on the Bechorah, looking down on the future, on the firstborn. After all, he says, I'm probably going to die anyway, so why do I have the firstborn? So too with that mockery. Again, Haman looking at Mordechai and saying, okay, I scorn Mordechai, so let me also annihilate the entire Jewish people. But perhaps one of the other proofs, and as we know, the more textual allusions we can find, the more that supports and the conscious playing and secret messages within the Megillah. All of a sudden we find what is known by biblical scholars, and Professor Noble and Yonatan Grossman of Yeshivat Har Etzion in particular points out, based on Noble's remarkable idea of having various scenes throughout Tanakh alluding to different characters, Yonatan Grossman calls this dynamic allusions. That if until now Haman has reminded us of Esav and Mordechai of Yaakov, then we see a very interesting turnabout, actually, at the climax of the story, when Mordechai, who has also to a certain degree hidden his Jewish identity, when he hears of the decree, of the genocidal decree against the Jewish people, Mordechai yada et kol asher nasa, vayikra Mordechai et begadav, vayilbas sak ve'efer. Mordechai tears his clothing, which is also interesting because we know of the motif of clothing that we're going to revisit from Parshat Toldot, from the Yaakov and Esav story. Vayilbas sak ve'efer, he dons sackcloth, vayitzei betoch ha'ir, vayizak zaka gdola umara. Also remarkable, Mordechai screams a horrible scream, a huge scream of anguish. The only other time that we find this phrase in all of Tanakh is once again back in the story of Yaakov and Esav. But here's the irony. In that story of the brachot, when Esav discovers that Yaakov has taken the bracha, what is his response to this? Again, that's when Esav himself, vayitzak tza'aka gedola umara ad ma'od. Wait a second. This is Esav, and in Megillat Esther, it's Mordechai. In other words, Mordechai is describing himself like Esav, and this is where the secret message lies. Mordechai and Esther are saying that we have a little bit of compunction that still remains within us from that story of Esav and Yaakov. Esav, one can argue, and albeit he sold the Bechorah, but Yitzchak really wants to bless Esav b'no hagadol. He is his favorite. Yitzchak adores Esav. And then we open up Megillat Esther and we see Gidal HaMelech Achashverosh et Haman. To a certain degree, Achashverosh is like Yitzchak. They're basically already telling us, Mordechai and Esther, please, again, this is the secret code. Achashverosh is like Yitzchak. Do you remember Yitzchak is blind? Yitzchak doesn't know the whole story. And yet Yitzchak is going to somehow favor Esav. Again, yes, Even if in the story of Sefer Bereishit, we don't know about the evil nature of Esav throughout history, and certainly through his descendant Amalek, this becomes very known, so much so that Esav and Edom are consistently used as the epitome of the nemesis of Am Yisrael. So now we understand this all the more. Mordechai and Esther are telling us, okay, this is the Yaakov and Esav story all over again. The blinded Achashverosh seems to side with Haman, and Haman, i.e. Esav, this is him all over again. He despises the Jews, just like Esav, again, wants to kill Yaakov. And Vayivez Esav et HaBechorah, they seem to scorn what really is important. Basically, that's going to be the beginning of the fall of Yaakov. But then what does Yaakov do? Yaakov changes his clothing. He guises himself as Esav. And as such, he procures the blessing of Yitzchak by disguising himself. Wait a moment. This is exactly what Mordechai and Esther are saying. Esther is also like Yaakov. Esther disguises herself, doesn't let blinded Achashverosh know her true identity. She is going to appear as an assimilated queen within the king's court, like Yaakov, who basically guises himself as Esav in front of Yitzchak. This idea, by the way, is certainly expounded upon by Rabbi David Foreman in Aleph Beta, and I just want to refer then to some basic ideas and messages that we're meant to extrapolate from the story. If Esther is like Yaakov, who disguises himself, then all of a sudden, here's the shifts in the story. Mordechai shows his true colors. Mordechai basically says, I'm not going to disguise myself as a Persian officer. I am going to tear my clothing. I am going to proudly march through the streets as a Jew who is the victim of this decree of annihilation. And this is where he reminds us of Esav, who really is the one who is not disguised. And this is the dynamic illusion, because we've been carrying this compunction with us for years, recognizing that Yaakov perhaps disguised himself and thereby didn't truly deserve the blessing. Mordechai and Esther want to tell you that they're the ones who are going to rewrite the tale and basically make a right out of this potential wrong. They're going to say, we do deserve the blessing. We deserve the blessing that Yitzchak gave Yaakov. V'yitin l'cha Elokim mital hashamayim. Because we're going to show that we're the victims here. That ultimately, Esav is the one who's scorning. Remember, he's the one who scorned the Bechorah. It's his descendant Haman who is going to scorn innocent Mordechai, i.e. Yaakov. And look what it leads to. It leads to exactly as Esav wanted to do, literally kill Yaakov. Comes Mordechai and says, and this time I'm Esav. I'm the one who deserves to the blessing. I'm the one who deserves to cry. You should be feeling badly for me in the story. I am the victim. And Haman / Esav is the one who wants to kill me. But what's remarkable then? The blinded Achashverosh isn't just Yitzchak in the story, but we find then that Mordechai, literally the caretaker of younger Esther, is going to serve as Rivka in the story. He is going to be the one to tell Esther, like Yaakov, okay, I will be the Esav. I will be the true victim of the story. But Esther, now it's your turn to be Yaakov. You have to go in disguise to the king. Vatilbash Esther Malchut. Esther dons her own disguise of Persian queenship as she appears in front of Achashverosh. And until, as we know, the second party, so to speak, when she finally says that she, in fact, Ani va'ami, that she and her entire people are under threat of annihilation, until that moment we wonder, does Achashverosh know? Does he suspect? Does he know that Esther is Jewish? Is she not Jewish? We don't know, just like Yitzchak. Does he know? Hakol kol Yaakov v'hayadayim yadei Esav. Does he know that it's Yaakov who's standing in front of him or not? And therefore it's Mordechai, like Rivka, who says, I'll take care of you. You have to go in disguised, and I'll worry about everything else. And certainly the matamim, the food, being used as the vehicle of disguise as well, almost like the mishteh, the intoxicating parties that are going to be used as the guise, as the ruse really behind the story, until finally, again, just like Yaakov, Esther goes in disguised, but ultimately that leads to her true colors. Reminiscent then of the entire plot of the story of the blessings of Yaakov and Esav, Hakol kol Yaakov v'hayadayim yedei Esav. That's exactly how Mordechai and Esther work together. Mordechai on one hand is Rivka, but he's also Yaakov and he's also Esav. He's the victim, and he's also going to be the perpetrator of the plan of Yaakov / Esther. And he's the one who's going to make the wrong of Yaakov understood to be right. This time, we're going to be Yaakov, but ultimately the true colors will be restored through not just the Yadayim of Esav, not just literally disguising ourselves as if we're Persian, but ultimately with the Kol of Yaakov. This time with the Tzom and with the Kri'ah and the Za'akeh, with the true voice of Tefillah. What a remarkable dynamic illusion Mordechai and Esther are teaching us. They're saying this time, yes, we're revisiting the story of that never-ending conflict, as Rabbi Shimon bar Yochai tells us, that this is a constant idea that Esav sonel Yaakov. The story of Megillat Esther, Mordechai and Esther want to tell us, go back to the story of Yaakov and Esav in Bereishit. And yes, it's the story all over again, but this time it's going to be done in such a way that you recognize that Yaakov is really right. Mordechai and Esther are going to initially disguise, but ultimately reveal, and therefore, Yitzchak / the blind to the Achashverosh, who initially favored the Gadol, who favored Gidel et Haman, who favored the Esav, will say, Gam Baruch Yihye, will ultimately offer and afford the proper blessing, the everlasting blessing, will now and untwist the twisted story of the brachot to say, so to speak, Gam Baruch Yihye, that Mordechai and Esther, the descendants of Yaakov, are the ones, in fact, who are able to overcome through the same technique of Yaakov, who are able to not just justify, but make the wrong right again. But we can't end the analogies with the story and the conflict of Yaakov and Esav, these two brothers, because there's another tale of brothers that's revisited through the story of Megillat Esther, and that is perhaps the story that takes us through the numerous chapters at the end of Sefer Bereishit, the story of Yosef and his brothers, of Sinat Achim. But this isn't just a tale, literally, of animosity, but a tale, really, of the tensions of the brothers and a tale of the powerful traits of particular brothers. Because if you ask anyone looking at the end of Sefer Bereishit, who does the Torah focus on in terms of the characters of the story, of the plot of the story, of literally Yosef's rise to viceroy in Egypt? And the answer is not just Yosef, clearly, but certainly Yehuda, who is going to be the one to not only suggest initially, what do we gain from killing our brother? Let's sell him. He basically is going to be the primary initiator for the sale of Yosef to Mitzrayim, again to the Midyanim, Yishmaelim, who will ultimately sell Yosef on the slave market. But there's one other, and that is Binyamin, who literally is going to be almost the collateral for going down to Mitzrayim to the viceroy. Yosef demands that they bring their younger brother before releasing Shimon from incarceration. It's going to be Binyamin, who has the suspected stolen goblet, who then Yehuda is going to rise to leadership. Anochi arvenu miyadi tebakshenu vayigash elav Yehuda. So what do you know? You open up Megillat Esther, and it's very hard not to see the immediate allusions of Mordechai HaYehudi on one hand. But wait a second. Again, Ish Yehudi Haya b'Shushan Habira Ushmo Mordechai ben Yair ben Shimi ben Kish Ish Yemini. Wait, he is on one hand associated with Yehuda because he really is from the area of Yehuda, from Judea. And yet, he's actually from the tribal descent of Binyamin. So we have a Binyamite who's associated with Yehuda and thereby the Yehudim. But then again, we also have so many parallels between the stories of Mordechai and Esther and how they're described in the same way that Yosef is described. Just as Esther is described as Yefat Toar, V'Tobat Mareh, so too Yosef. Both beautiful people who are taken, what do you know? They're abducted from their homes, from their original homes and from their families. They're taken to the king's court. So we have a Yosef story together with a Binyamin and a Yehuda story. And this is what's truly remarkable. There's so many associations between the way that Esther and Mordechai, by the way, are described that remind us of Yosef himself. Just as Esther is going to carry literally the kindness and the grace of others before her in front of everyone, whether it be the Hegei, Shomer Hanashim, the bodyguards, and all the eunuchs of the king, and certainly the king himself. What do you know? We have very similar stages of Yosef being or finding favor with those exact terms of Yosef finding favor in Potiphar's eyes. And then the Sar Beit HaSohar, when he's then accused by Eshet Potiphar and placed in the dungeons of Egypt. There, once again, he finds favor in front of everyone, just like Esther in the harem, literally one can say, the dungeons of Persia. And then we find another association, and that is that just as Esther finds favor in front of the king, so does Yosef. And that leads to not just Esther becoming queen as Yosef became viceroy. But what do you know? By the end of the story, we find Mishneh Lamelech is afforded not just to Yosef, but also to Mordechai. And just as Mordechai and Esther go out of their way to basically say, yeah, they're Yosef all over again, just as Yosef has his Hebrew name Yosef, but also his foreign Egyptian name Tzafna Paneach, so too Esther is introduced as having her Persian name Esther Ashtart, but also Hadassah, he Esther. Just like Yosef, she also carries this dual identity. And just as Mordechai is going to be promoted to viceroy with a chariot, with a horse riding, with Ratzim Lefanav, those that are going to call before him, so too Yosef when he interprets the dreams of Paro. And just as there's a night scene of the king when he's very disturbed and he ends up again reading about the story of Mordechai saving him, reminiscent of Paro, who has a terrible night scene of disturbing dreams, and then Sarah Hamashkim has to remind Paro basically of how Yosef saved him and interpreted his dreams. And sure enough, we also have the association of the promotion, not only with the horses and with a crown, and also with a Tabat HaMelech, the same signet ring that's given as described by Paro to Yosef, is given by Achashverosh to Mordechai. So all the various associations with the Malchut, with the foreign kingdom, with the promotion to a viceroy. These are the only two characters in Tanakh whom we hear are literally the vice presidents. They are the second in command to the king in a foreign country. And what do you know? One is Yosef, the other is Ishimini, is Binyamin, who are from the same family. This is a story really of B'nai Rachel, which reminiscent then of all the qualities of Rachel, which is why Chazal tell us that Esther was very similar to Rachel, just like Rachel adopted the trait of shtika, literally of silence, and that she did not reveal to Yaakov that Leah was going to be given in her place. So too, Esther does not reveal her identity. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, what is the point of all of these allusions? And just when you think that it's Mordechai and Esther playing the role of Yosef, they themselves weave even the plot of the story into the Megillah in a remarkable manner. Because if you remember, when Esther is coronated as queen, immediately thereafter we hear of a phenomenal story. Bayamim hahem uMordechai Yoshe b'shar hamelech katzaf biktan vateresh shnei sarisei hamelech mishomrei hasaf. Esther is now elected basically to the king's court, but Mordechai is still unidentified. But we hear of two Sarisei HaMelech, literally two officers of the king. And what are their names? Bigtan Vateresh. And they're accused of Vayivakshu l'shloach yad b'melech Achashverosh. They're accused of wanting to assassinate the king. Vayivadah hadavar leMordechai. Mordechai is able to find out this information. Vayagid leEsther hamalka b'tomer Esther hamalka b'shem Mordechai. Esther serves as a conduit to basically bring Mordechai's secret interpretation, we can say it, to the king. Vayivu kasha davar, and this is going to be researched by Yimatzeh, and it's going to be found. Vayitlu shnehem al eitz vayikateh b'sefer divrei hayamim lifnei hamelech. And in the end, again, vayitalu shnehem al eitz, they're both hanged. This sounds very familiar. Two officers of the king who are going to be accused of wanting to assassinate the king, and in the end, there's a hanging on the tree. Well, just in case you're not convinced, Mordechai and Esther know that you, assimilated Jews in Persia, you know not only the Yaakov and Esav story, you know the Yosef story, you know Tanakh. Tanakh is in your blood, and therefore they're writing in a secret code, knowing that this is going to be censored by the king, but knowing that you're going to extrapolate the message in disguise. Who are Bigtan and Teresh? Strange names. Yes, Persian names. Bigtan, bag. I know that term from Sefer Daniel. And that is the term that is used for, as Daniel says, pat bag hamelech. The bag is pat. Literally, bag in Persian means bread. So who is Mr. Bigtan? Bigtan is none other than the baker. And who is Teresh? Teresh, tirosh, I know that word. Tirosh is wine. Wait a second. Bigtan and Teresh are not their personal names. These are the terms that are used for these particular officers. One is Bigtan, is the baker. The other is Teresh, tirosh, the butler. The baker and the butler want to kill the king. And I feel like we're playing Clue for a moment. But really, again, they want to kill the king, and they're going to be put under isolation. And through Mordechai, in the end, not only are they going to be hanging on a tree, but this is a story that ultimately the king is going to revisit that makes him think, wait a second, how am I going to reward someone who the king requests to reward? How will I, he asks Haman, reward Ha'ish asher hamelech hafetz bikaru? And the suggestion is going to be, yes, put him on the king's horse and put him in the king's garments and give him the king's signet ring and give him the king's crown and have people run before him. When we realize Mordechai and Esther are telling you, do you know what the story is? This is the story of a baker and a butler. Going back to the story of Yosef. Do you remember Sarah Mashkim, Sarah Ophim? That's exactly who they are. The baker and the butler are in the dungeons of Egypt together with Yosef because of an attempt to assassinate the king. And through Yosef revealing the interpretation of their dreams, which he explains are really inspired by Elokim, Elokim HaPetronot. That's how ultimately the Sar HaMashkim is going to revisit his position as the butler before the king, as the Sar HaMashkim. The Sar HaOphim is going to be hanged. And through the Sar HaMashkim, basically forgetting, but then remembering Yosef through the dreams, literally the night scene of the king, he's going to be reminded of Yosef, and then Yosef is going to be promoted with the king's horse, the king's chariots, the king's ring, the king's robes, the ratzim lefanav, literally people calling out before him. Mordechai and Esther are teaching us what Chazal tell us. They say just as in the story of Yosef, Hashem aroused the wrath of the king against the baker and the butler in order to provide for the rise of Yosef to Malchut, so that Yosef could provide for the economic sustenance and the cosmic survival of Bnei Yisrael. So too, that's exactly what Mordechai and Esther are writing. That yes, just as Hashem was behind that story, they weave HaKadosh Baruch Hu through Tanakh. You know the story of the baker and the butler. Guess what? The baker and the butler play a role in this story also, meaning Hashem plays a role in this story also. Hashem made sure that there would be a baker and a butler, and Mordechai, serving as the Yosef parallel, is going to be the one to deliver the message to Esther, and through whom the message will be brought before the king, who will be reminded also in the middle of the night, Vayhi b'chatzi halayla, he v'balayla hu nadadashna tamelech, just as Paro couldn't sleep, Achashverosh won't be able to sleep. And again, through Mordechai, just like Yosef, through Hashem arousing the baker and the butler, salvation will come, and the Mordechai, descendant of Rachel, will bring us back through these allusions to Yosef, the son of Rachel, to be the viceroy to the king Paro Achashverosh. You're all supposed to say wow at this point and realize how Mordechai and Esther are truly weaving the biblical stories in. They are clearly alluding back to the stories of Bereishit. And now the question is obviously why. This isn't just to tell us that Rachel passes on certain traits of tzniut and traits of malchut, again through her son Yosef and ultimately through Mordechai and Esther. There's so much more that meets the eye. What Mordechai and Esther are basically trying to tell us is that yes, number one, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is behind the scenes, but let's go back to the fact that these are actually B'nai Binyamin. Wait a second, these are Yosef parallels, but also Binyamin parallels. Yes, of course, they're brothers, they're both sons of Rachel, but there's also Yehuda in the story because Mordechai is also described as Ish Yehudi. And obviously, the decree of genocide is against the Yehudim, laharogu la'abed et kol ha-Yehudim. What happens in that story of Yosef? Yosef consciously places the goblet in the sack of Binyamin, and it's going to be Yehuda who puts his life on the line in front of Yosef for Binyamin. Yehuda is the one deserving of malchut, because he took responsibility for Binyamin, for the other. And that's exactly what Mordechai turns to Esther as he writes, as they allude to the story. And he says, we have to write the story this way, Esther, because don't you realize, if you're silent right now, Yehuda will always be okay. The Yehudim are always going to be the Malachim. Yehuda will always have Malchut. Va'at ubeit avich tovedu. But wait, you're from Binyamin. You're from the house of Shaul. So stay tuned to all of our Shaul parallels. But then Yehuda will always rise above Binyamin. Esther, this is an opportunity to finally redeem Binyamin, to finally redeem the house of Shaul, to finally have literally a balance of power that will provide for Achdut. If in the story of Bereishit, they're writing about how Yehuda took responsibility for Binyamin in front of Yosef, then this time, it's time for Binyamin to take responsibility and protect Yehuda and all the Yehudim. And if she does, if the descendant of Binyamin does, then she deserves Malchut as well. And even when she deserves Malchut, and even when Mordechai, as her peer, deserves the Malchut, just like Yosef, though, it will only be the Mishnah Lamelech. It'll only be Ratzoi L'Rovechav, because the other message is not only the Arivut Hadadit, is not just the mutual responsibility between members of Am Yisrael, that they write and rewrite the stories of Yosef, Yehuda, and Binyamin in order to remind us that we each have to protect one another. And it's not enough for Yehuda to always take responsibility for Binyamin, but Binyamin has to do so for Yehuda in a symbiotic way. But it's also a reminder that then when you advance to power, to remind you that in Chutz La'aretz, though, you only advance until Mishneh Lamelech. They rewrite the stories as Yosef and Mitzrayim because, of course, they are alluding to the success of the Jewish people, the salvation of the Jewish people through descendants of Rachel in Chutz La'aretz, through Yosef, Mordechai, and Esther. But they're also reminding us that it's a very fleeting malchut, that in Chutz La'aretz, the most you can do is run for vice presidency. But, Hannah, you can succeed even in Chutz La'aretz, but to a limit. And perhaps what they're also alluding to is that you can succeed. And yes, of course, just like Yosef and his adversaries, Mordechai and Esther, and the Jews of the time are going to have their adversaries and anti-Semitism. And maybe they want to allude back to Yosef to remind you as well that eventually the day will come when Vayamat Yosef v'kol achav v'chol hador hahu vayakam melech hadash al Mitzrayim asher lo yada et Yosef. Maybe what they're telling us is, look at the story of salvation. Look at this remarkable story of the success of the Jewish people, even amidst the anti-Semitism of exile. But they're also alluding to the danger that lurks behind the corner, knowing that, just like in the Yosef story, when the generation is over, then there is what to fear. We look back then and appreciate how through Megillat Esther, we literally get to revisit every story in Tanakh. So if through the story of Mordechai and Esther, we revisit stories of Galut, we revisit stories of sibling rivalry, of tension, but also resolution of stories, then stay tuned for Sefer Shemot, where we're going to see how redemption is revisited in Megillat Esther.
Thank you for joining us for Secrets of the Scroll with Rabbanit Shani Taragin. This series is presented by Matan and World Mizrahi and powered by Walder Foundation. We hope today's conversation inspired you, sparked new ideas, and deepened your connection to the text and its meaning. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends or family who would appreciate these conversations. Your support helps us continue bringing thoughtful, meaningful Torah to the wider audience. We look forward to learning together again soon. See you in the next episode of Secrets of the Scroll with Rabbanit Shani Taragin.